Anti-trans talking points come in many shapes and sizes. One of the more esoteric arguments, often made in feminist and academic settings, is that trans people, especially those of us who transition, that is to say, transsexuals, supposedly reinforce gender stereotypes, or the gender system more generally. I first countered such arguments in my 2007 book, Whipping Girl. Here's a handful of such claims, but there are countless others. Upon seeing analogous claims levied against feminine women, bisexuals, and even lesbians if you go far enough back, I became convinced that these sorts of arguments represent a fundamental flaw in our thinking, scholarship, and activism. So in 2011, when I was invited to give a keynote at a Lewis and Clark College Gender Studies Symposium, I penned the following talk, entitled Compulsory Genderqueerness, on Transsexuality, Feminism, and the End of Gender. This talk would later form the basis of Chapter 12 of my 2013 book, Excluded, Making Feminist and Queer Movements More Inclusive. I'm sharing this now not only because contemporary gender-critical activists continue to make these reinforcing gender arguments in their attempts to undermine trans people, but because, in some corners of the internet, there's been a reemergence of claims that non-binary and/or non-transition trans people subvert gender, whereas transsexuals supposedly reinforce it. I first wrote about these claims in Whipping Girl, but I completely dismantled them here. So what follows is my 2011 talk, edited for length. I've omitted the beginning of the talk, in which I explain terminology and why I focus on transsexuality, and highlighted the many parallels that exist between heterosexism and cissexism, both being double standards that depict LGB and trans identities and experiences as artificial, questionable, and less legitimate than our hetero and cis counterparts, respectively. If you're interested in those parallels, that passage can be found in the aforementioned Excluded chapter. Also, the issue of whether there's any biological influence on gender and sexuality, and thus trans and LGB identities, is alluded to in the talk. I further discuss the controversies and complexities surrounding that topic in the subsequent chapter of Excluded, as well as in my recent YouTube video, Trans People and Biological Sex, What the Science Says. Regarding the talk, the first 23 minutes of footage was recorded by event organizers, but unfortunately cut off midway through. So the remaining 18 minutes or so is from an audio recording I made of the same talk, which is more echoey and has more room noise, but should be sufficient to hear what I'm saying. If not, feel free to use closed captions. On a personal note, I was initially reluctant to share this video because at the time I was dealing with psoriasis, an autoimmune condition I have that's been mostly in remission lately. But back in 2011, it wreaked havoc on my scalp and I temporarily lost a lot of my hair as a result. But since this is my most comprehensive rebuttal of the reinforcing trope and feminist end of gender arguments, I figured that outweighs any self-consciousness on my part. So here it is. As always, please click the like button so that more people see this video, and the subscribe button to be notified about my future videos, as I have a few in the works. Finally, if you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon for as little as $1 per month.
The issue of transsexuality has come up over and over again in cissexual feminist theory. In the trans, queer, and feminist circles I inhabit, I find that there's a recurring narrative that's often told to describe the supposed evolution of feminist thought about transsexual issues and individuals. According to this narrative, the negative views of transsexuality held by many second-wave feminists, for example, radical feminists and lesbian feminists, are attributed to gender essentialism, whereas the acceptance and sometimes even embrace of the phenomena by more recent feminists, for example, queer theorists and post-structuralists, arises from the recognition that sex and gender are both socially constructed. I personally believe that this narrative both misrepresents the concerns of radical and lesbian feminists, and it overlooks the high degree of ambivalence that social constructionists have expressed towards transsexuality over the years. So instead, here today, I'm going to be making the case that the views of transsexuality forwarded by all of the aforementioned camps of feminist thought actually have more in common with one another than they are different. And the reason for this similarity stems from their shared belief in what I call, and I'd like to coin new phrases, gender artifactualization, okay? So gender artifactualization is the tendency to conceptualize and depict gender as being primarily or entirely a cultural artifact. Cissexual feminist fascination with transsexuality, where it has occurred, has typically been motivated not necessarily by concern with transsexual individuals, but by an interest in how the existence of transsexuality might impact or provide support for gender artifactualist perspectives in politics. So it's very, very important here to make a distinction between gender artifactualization and social constructionism. To have a social constructionist view of gender, by most standard definitions, simply means that one believes that gender does not arise in a direct and unadulterated manner from biology, but rather that it's shaped to some extent by culture. For example, by socialization, gender norms, gender-related ideology, language labels, and such that constrain and influence our understanding of the matter. By this definition, I am most certainly a social constructionist. Gender artifactualists, however, are typically not content to merely discuss the ways in which gender may be socially constructed, but rather they discount or purposefully ignore the possibility that biology and biological variation also may play a role in constraining and shaping our genders. Sometimes even the most nuanced and carefully qualified suggestions that biology may have some influence on gendered behaviors or desires will garner accusations of essentialism in gender artifactualist circles. And I should know, because I've been called essentialist in gender artifactualist circles. Okay. Okay, there have been two major approaches to gender artifactualism. Some subscribe to a sex-gender distinction, where the primary focus is on gender, which is associated with the mind and viewed as entirely social and learned, whereas sex, the biological, is relegated exclusively to the body and assumed to play little to no role in gendered behavior. Other gender artifactualists instead make the case that sex is just as much a cultural artifact as gender. It has been my experience that many, albeit certainly not all, feminists who describe themselves as social constructionists, in fact, forward gender artifactualist positions. This tendency is perhaps most blatantly obvious in popular soundbites that are often quoted in feminist or gender study settings. For example, that all gender is performance, or that gender is just a construct. Such phrases seem to intentionally deny any possible role for biology or biological variation. Gender artifactualism tends to be embraced in more radical or revolutionary feminist traditions, for example, radical feminism, lesbian feminism, post-structuralism, and queer theory, because it forcibly challenges biological determinist notions that dominate in our culture. More importantly, gender artifactualism allows one to view gender solely in terms of a hegemonic gender system that may be challenged, undermined, subverted, displaced, or overthrown. Of course, this hegemonic gender system goes by many, many names. For example, some people call it the patriarchy, or the sex-gender system, or compulsory heterosexuality, or the heterosexual matrix, or the gender binary, and so on. So for simplicity, for the rest of my talk, I'm just going to be referring to these types of gender systems as the gender system, which sounds really ominous, so it sounds cool. Okay. So the gender artifactualist belief that woman and man are entirely socially derived categories foisted upon us by an oppressive gender system automatically forecloses any possibility that there might be non-social or intrinsic factors that influence or predispose one to cross-gender identification. As a result, gender artifactualists have typically dismissed transsexuals' claims of having a deep, profound, subconscious self-understanding of which sex they belong to, and have instead presumed that transsexuality is a form of false consciousness that arises as a symptom or byproduct of the gender system. So for example, Sandra Bem, who's a feminist psychologist, claimed that, quote, transsexualism would be much better conceptualized as the underside of the same process of gender polarization that also produces highly conventional males and females. In a less gender polarizing culture, after all, it would matter much less if the individual's personality did not cohere to a tightly gender polarized package that matched her or his biological sex, end quote. Similarly, feminist sociologist Margaret Eichler claimed that, quote, transsexual patients have an excessively narrow image of what constitutes sex-appropriate behavior. Were the notions of masculinity and femininity less rigid, sex change operations would be unnecessary, end quote. So further, because gender artifactualists believe that the categories of woman and man underpin the gender system, they often view transsexuals and or transsexuality as enabling or reinforcing the gender system. So the most hardline take on this view has been advocated by radical and lesbian-identified cissexual feminists, such as Janice Raymond and Sheila Jeffries. In her infamous book, Transsexual Empire, Raymond argues, quote, "Patriarchal society and its social currents of masculinity and femininity are the first cause of transsexualism. Within such a society, the transsexual only exchanges one stereotype for the other, thus reinforcing the fabric by which a sexist society is held together," end quote. Similarly, Jeffries views transsexuals and others on the transgender spectrum as, quote, "engaging in behavior which is in opposition to the feminist project of the elimination of gender, thereby helping to maintain the currency of gender," end quote. Critics of Jeffries and Raymond often dismiss their work on the grounds that it's rooted in gender essentialism. I hear that all the time. I would argue that such claims are somewhat off the mark. After all, the main point, the take-home point that these authors are making, which is that transsexuals buy into and reinforce the gender system, is not rooted in gender essentialism, but in gender artifactualism. Indeed, the force of their critiques rests entirely on the assumption that gender identity and expression are cultural artifacts and that have no biological basis and that serve the sole purpose of maintaining the gender system. Furthermore, conclusions that are very similar to Raymond's and Jeffries' radical feminist perspectives have been forwarded by a variety of social constructionists and post-structuralist theorists. So for example, Judith Lorber, who according to Promotion for her book Paradoxes of Gender argues that gender is wholly a product of socialization, has said, quote, "Transsexuals do not challenge the social construction of gender. Their goal is to be masculine men and feminine women," end quote. Serena Nanda, who's an anthropologist who celebrates how so-called third gender categories in other cultures challenge Western notions of binary gender, claims that, quote, "Transsexuals, far from being an example of gender diversity, both reflected and reinforced the dominant Euro-American sex-gender ideology in which one had to choose to be either a man or a stereotypical woman," end quote. Other theorists who take psychoanalytic or post-structuralist approaches, such as Carol Ann Tyler, Bernice Hausman, and Marjorie Garber, have portrayed transsexuals as being semiotically challenged individuals who take signifiers a little too seriously and therefore wind up literalizing, essentializing, and literally embodying aspects of the gender system at the same time that they simultaneously reveal gender's constructed nature. While all these critiques differ from one another and from those of Jeffries and Raymond, they all rely on the exact same gender artifactualist logic. 1, gender is a cultural artifact. 2, transsexuals mistake gender for being something real rather than recognizing it as something artificial. And 3, therefore, they reify the gender system. QED. Sorry, that was for the geeks in the house. Okay, so now from a transsexual perspective, for example mine, such claims that we reinforce or uphold the gender system seem rather odd. For one thing, I didn't transition in order to better fit myself into the gender system. As a bisexual, tomboyish woman, I'm still regularly viewed as gender nonconforming. For me, transitioning wasn't about conforming to society, but rather about self-actualization, about becoming the person that I know that I am. In fact, I would argue that changing your sex tends to be viewed by most people as pretty much the most extreme act of gender nonconformity one could engage in. When I come out to people as transsexual, to like straight mainstream folks, I have never once heard someone say, "Oh, that's great. Thank you, Julia Serrano, for reinforcing our gender binary. You know, you're such a good gendered citizen." In fact, quite the opposite tends to happen. People often become bothered or confused or disturbed. So the idea that my gender reinforces the gender system does not have any bearing or resemblance to my everyday life. But here's what strikes me most about the reinforcing the gender binary system claim. It's that how selectively it's doled out. For example, I've never once heard a cissexual feminist say, "My mom reinforces the gender binary. My next door neighbor upholds heterosexist gender norms," even though these things could possibly be true. Even more to the point, if a cissexual feminist, such as Janice Raymond or Judith Lorber or Sandra Bem, were to call themselves a woman and to do something generally associated with women, would it spark great debates within feminist circles over whether these individuals reinforce the gender system? I think not. Therefore, the reinforcing the gender system trope seems to represent a double standard in that it's routinely applied to transsexuals, but not most cissexuals. So in other words, that double standard is cissexism. Trans man Maxwell Fillery provides an anecdote that illustrates just how ridiculous this double standard is. He had the opportunity to speak with a class on transgender and transsexuality just after they viewed a short documentary on him. A student in the class asked him how he felt about, quote, holding up stereotypical sex roles, end quote, which is a reference to the fact that at one point in the film, he boxes the camera. Recalling the question, Max writes, quote, "How do you feel, I might have asked, when you wear lipstick or a dress, or cook dinner for a partner, or unable to fix a mechanical device and ask for help, or nurture an infant, or talk on the phone about your feelings, or sit in a circle to process? That is, anytime you do anything considered typical of women. Would you only be filmed doing things that women are never supposed to do, or haven't typically done? Do you think about these issues all day long and monitor your actions and thoughts to prevent slipping up and buying into the bipolar gender system? Probably not. Then why expect me or any other transsexual to?" End quote. So, as I noted earlier, a major way in which cissexism is enforced is via the assumption that transsexual gender identities and expressions and sex embodiments are fake and therefore can be called into question, whereas their cissexual counterparts are real and therefore taken for granted and unquestioned, not questioned. This discrepancy explains why transsexuals seem to garner more disdain and criticism for reinforcing the gender system than the gender-normative cissexual majority. Further, because cissexism causes cissexual-minded people to constitutively view transsexuals as fakes, as mere imitations or impersonations of cissexual genders, such people are inclined to misperceive and misinterpret transsexuals as actively and purposefully trying to fit themselves into female and male stereotypes, even when they are not. Now granted, some transsexuals do purposefully emulate the behaviors of cissexual men and women, as many cissexuals purposefully emulate the behaviors of cissexual women and men, right? And a lot of times transsexuals feel extra pressure to do this in order to pass successfully as cissexual. And this is an important distinction. I don't pass as a woman. I am a woman. I pass as a cissexual, okay? So cissexual feminist theorists seem to share the mainstream media's fascination with capturing transsexuals in the act of affecting, practicing, or performing femaleness and maleness. And all you have to do is look at most kind of feminist writings about transsexuality, and they often go into these displays of transsexuals kind of performing their genders that really perfectly mimic what I see when I watch media depictions. Most often these depictions focus on transsexuals who are newly embarking on social and physical transition, that is, transsexuals who are at their most gender incongruous, at their most visibly fake. An investment in fakeness is evident in most cissexual feminist accounts of transsexuality, whether it's Raymond and Jeffries, who rebuke transsexuals for acting like grossly exaggerated caricatures of feminine stereotypes, or Tyler, Hausman, and Garber, whose primary interests are in the ways in which transsexuals make the artificial and constructed nature of gender appear visible. Once we acknowledge this double standard with regards to fakeness, then it becomes evident that many feminist writings that are not blatantly anti-transsexual are nevertheless rooted in cissexism. So for example, Kessler McKenna's classic book, Gender, an Ethno-Methodological Approach, which is a book that has a lot of really awesome parts to it, in it they dedicate an entire chapter to exploring, quote, what transsexualism can illuminate about the day-to-day social construction of gender by all persons, end quote. But I would ask, if all people's genders are constructed, then why focus on transsexuals? Like, why focus on this weird kind of exception, this small minority of people? If all of our genders are constructed, why just focus on transsexuals? This is their reasoning. Quote, it is easier for us to see that transsexuals do, parentheses, accomplish, gender than it is to see this process in non-transsexuals, end quote. So they make this very interesting claim, but they never take the next step and ask, well, why would that be? Why is that? While they never explicitly spell out why, it seems rather obvious, to me at least, that this is due to the fact that transsexual genders are already assumed to be fake a priori. Thus, their approach to gender both relies upon and also exacerbates societal cissexism. So to really kind of emphasize just what is so problematic about this, consider the following analogy. What if a sociologist hope to demonstrate the socially constructed nature of monogamy? And to make their case, they focused on same-sex rather than heterosexual couples, because they felt that the former better illustrated the ways in which monogamous relationships are artificial and contrived. Now, clearly, such an approach would reinforce the heterosexist assumption that same-sex relationships are natural and illegitimate and inferior copies of heterosexual relationships. It would also exploit those who cannot socially and legally take their desires and relationships for granted in the way that heterosexual majority can. So similarly, using transsexuals to illuminate the artificial nature of gender exploits the fact that transsexuals are viewed as fakes and that we cannot socially or legally take our gender identities and sex embodiments for granted. Okay, so that's kind of the background to like feminist discourses. And so these politics, what I would call gender artifactualist politics, place an extraordinary burden on feminist-minded transsexuals. In order to gain inclusion within feminism, transsexuals must constantly address accusations that they reinforce the gender system. If they assert that they transition not to reinforce the gender system, but because they experience a deeply felt self-understanding that they should be the other sex, their response will likely be dismissed as essentialist and taken as a sign that they buy into the gender system. And once again, I should know because this has happened to me. Seemingly, the only other alternative, other than abandoning feminism altogether, is to reframe their cross-gender identity in political terms, rather than personal terms, by arguing that their transsexual gender identities, expressions, and sex embodiments call the gender system into question, thus subverting it. This is precisely the approach taken during the initial rise of the transgender movement in the 1990s, and is perhaps most evident in the writings of Kate Bornstein, Leslie Feinberg, and Ricky Wilkins. These authors use their own gender incongruity to destabilize and deconstruct the male-female binary, and they regularly draw parallels between their own gender transgressions and those of cissexual gender nonconformists. The notion that transgender people subvert or shatter the gender binary was strengthened by the fact that these authors all explicitly identify outside the binary. In today's parlance, we would describe their gender identities as genderqueer, which is an umbrella term for people who see themselves as being neither a man nor a woman, or perhaps a little bit of both, and or moving freely between genders. In addition to having a huge positive impact on me as a young trans person many years ago, the writings of these and other activists made great strides towards convincing many cissexual feminists that transgender people could be allies in the fight against sexism. This is clearly a very good thing. However, reframing transgender bodies and identities in purely political terms has several drawbacks. So first, it is somewhat disingenuous. After all, as I've said a couple times now, many trans folks experience an inexplicable feeling that there's something wrong with the sex they were assigned at birth long before being exposed to any kind of gender politics. So playing up our supposed political motives while playing down our personal motives essentially erases trans people's subjectivity. Second, this approach has encouraged some cissexuals who have no history of cross-gender identity whatsoever to embrace a transgender or genderqueer identity out of a desire to shatter the gender binary. I often refer to such people as being intellectually genderqueer. And I do not mean that as a pejorative. I just mean that it's not coming from a personal feeling of knowing something about yourself, but it's coming out of a political analysis. In certain times and spaces, intellectually genderqueer voices dominate discussions about transgender people and issues. This can be problematic, especially for transsexuals, as it once again casts trans solely as a political move to shatter the gender binary, while erasing the very real obstacles trans people face, namely the fact that we're seen as fakes and illegitimate members of our identified gender. So third, the claim that trans people subvert the gender system has been routinely twisted by many cissexual feminists, as well as some transgender activists, into an expectation that trans people must actively refuse to identify within the male-female binary and constantly make their gender incongruity visible in order to be viewed as sufficiently feminist. As a result, gender-variant people who fail to meet such criteria, for example, transsexuals who fully transition and identify as women and men, still to this day remain subject to the accusation that they reinforce the gender system. This expectation, which I often half-jokingly refer to as compulsory genderqueerness, hence the title of the talk, is something that I've personally faced time and time again in feminist settings, and it's both endlessly frustrating and utterly silly. After all, the aspects about my person that most often get me called out for reinforcing the gender binary, namely the fact that my gender identity and presentation are unqualifiedly female, are the traits that also apply to the overwhelming majority of cissexual feminist women. But of course, unlike me, they are never called out for the fact that they identify as women or wear women's clothing. So clearly, this tactic of politicizing transgender identities under the rubric of "we subvert the gender system" is a well-meaning attempt to gain legitimacy for trans folks, but in the end, it fails. And it fails because it does not challenge the core problem, cissexism. This failure is especially evident in feminist critiques of claims that trans people subvert the gender system. So for example, Bernice Hausman dismisses transgender politics as being liberal or reformist because, quote, transsexualism and transgenderism rely on maintaining gender as a category of experience and being, end quote. In other words, trans people fail to recognize the gender artifactualist position that, she says, quote, gender itself is only, her emphasis, a convention, end quote. Raymond makes pretty much the exact same point in her 1994 essay on the rise of transgender politics, when she argues that trans people, quote, rather than transcending, that is, dismantling and going beyond gender roles, seek to combine aspects of traditional femininity with aspects of traditional masculinity, end quote. I cannot tell you how many times I have read and heard claims that feminists are trying to, quote, move beyond gender, or to bring on the end of gender, evoked in attempts to portray transsexuality and transgenderism as antithetical to feminism. So here's what I want to know. What exactly is the end of gender? What does it look like? Are there words to describe male and female bodies at the end of gender? Or do we purge all words that refer to male and female specific body parts and reproductive functions for fear that they will reinforce gender distinctions? Do we do away with activities such as sports, sewing, shaving, cooking, fixing cars, taking care of children, and of course man on top, woman on bottom penetration sex, because these have been too closely associated with traditional masculine and feminine roles in the past? What clothes do we wear at the end of gender? Do we all wear pants? Do we all wear skirts? Or do we have to come up with a completely different type of clothing altogether? Or perhaps we must go naked. Because after all, clothing has a long and troubled history of conspiring with the gender system. Who gets to make these decisions? Who gets to decide what is gender and what is not? By what criteria does one determine whether any given behavior is a wholesome, natural human trait or an abominable social artifact? It seems clear to me that everybody has a somewhat different view of what is in gender and therefore bad, and what is outside of gender and therefore good. I have been in spaces that are predominantly genderqueer, where I've heard people claim that anyone who uses male or female pronouns necessarily reinforces the gender system. I have also, on more than one occasion, heard people who identify as pansexual suggest that people who are exclusively attracted to one sex or the other reinforce the gender binary. So apparently, reinforcing the gender system, like beauty, is truly in the eye of the beholder. A few years back, I thought about writing a satirical manifesto mocking the reinforcing trope. I would begin by claiming that the gender system is rooted in the premise that if you're born a boy, then you'll grow up to be a man, and if you're born a girl, then you'll grow up to be a woman. And, based on this premise, I would go on to argue that transsexuals are the cutting edge, the vanguard, if you will, of the gender revolution, whereas cissexuals, by virtue of the refusal to change their sex, reinforce the gender system. I know I could have made a convincing case, and it would have been really, really fun to write.
But in the end, I decided not to do it because I knew that sadly, in the end, there would probably be some people who would take me seriously. While transsexuals or pansexuals or genderqueers may have their own ideas about what reinforces or subverts the gender system, such views are usually not taken especially seriously in feminist circles because these groups constitute small minorities. However, majority opinions do prevail. And in a world where most people, and this includes cissexual feminists, consciously or unconsciously view transsexuality as illegitimate, as fake, and as questionable, those of us who are transsexual are marked. And our behaviors and life choices will inevitably be placed under the microscope. Now, if I wanted, I could end my talk here by saying cissexism is bad and transsexuals do not reinforce the gender binary, and we could all go home feeling good about ourselves. But I'm not going to do that. I think that there's a far greater lesson to be learned here. And if we follow this through to its logical conclusion. So since I've been making this analogy between cissexism and heterosexism throughout my talk, one might ask, what if most feminists believe that same-sex relationships were inherently less natural and valid than their heterosexual counterparts? Might this possibly result in lesbians or bisexuals being accused of reinforcing the gender system? Well, this is not a hypothetical question. We can simply look back in history to the late 1960s when the gay rights movement, as we know it, was still in its infancy. Now, I'm not talking here about liberal feminists such as Betty Friedan, who once infamously described lesbian feminists as the lavender menace. I'm talking about radical feminists who forwarded a view of gender that nowadays we might describe as social constructionist, or which I might call gender artifactualist. Radical feminists often referred to the gender system as they saw it as male supremacy or the sex class system. Okay, so how did these radical feminists react to lesbians within their ranks? Well, according to Alice Eccles' book, Daring to be Bad, Radical Feminism in America in 1967 to 1975, which is a super excellent book, early on, radical feminists often made accusations about lesbianism that were eerily similar to those that have been subsequently made regarding transsexuality. For instance, some radical feminists claimed that lesbians were hypersexual and oppressively male, and were, quote, too attached to sex roles. Ty Grace Atkinson, who's a radical feminist who would eventually undergo an evolution with regards to her views about lesbianism, she once said, quote, because lesbianism involves role play, and more important, because it's based on the primary assumption of male oppression, that is, sex, lesbianism reinforces the sex class system. So, what did lesbians do in order to gain legitimacy? You guessed it, they claimed that lesbianism subverted rather than reinforced the gender system. One of the most significant expressions of this move is found in the manifesto titled The Woman-Identified Woman, which is written by a group called Radical Lesbians, in which they argue that lesbians, rather than being, in Eccles' words, quote, male-identified boogie women out to exploit other women, read reinforcing the gender system, they were woman-identified. That is, they subverted the gender system by choosing women as partners rather than men. As Eccles explains, they, quote, accomplished this by redefining lesbianism as a primarily political choice, end quote. So essentially, this is the exact same approach taken by transgender activists in the 1990s. And according to Eccles, it worked to some extent in that it made heterosexual radical feminists more accepting of lesbianism. But if lesbians are woman-identified, and if that subverts the gender system, then doesn't that kind of sort of imply that heterosexual feminists are male-identified and therefore reinforce that system? Well, that's exactly what some lesbian feminists eventually went on to argue. So as Alice Eccles describes, one particularly influential lesbian feminist group, the Furies, viewed, quote, heterosexuality as the cornerstone of male supremacy and lesbianism as the greatest threat to its continued existence, end quote. In an article in their paper, one of the Furies claimed, quote, lesbianism is not a matter of sexual preference, but rather one of political choice, which every woman must make if she is to become woman-identified and thereby end male supremacy, end quote. In a 1971 pamphlet entitled Lesbianism and Feminism, radical feminist and, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name, Coate, who's most famous for her essay, The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm, she described the situation this way, quote, If you're a feminist who's not sleeping with a woman, you may risk hearing any of the following accusations. You're oppressing me if you don't sleep with women. You're not a radical feminist if you don't sleep with women. You don't love women if you don't sleep with them. I have even seen a woman's argument about an entirely different aspect of feminism dismissed by some lesbians because she was not having sexual relations with women, end quote. Coate refers to this phenomenon as, quote, the perversion of the personal's political argument, end quote. So for those who aren't familiar with the phrase the personal is political, it refers to this practice of women examining their own personal lives in order to better understand the institutionalized sexism they faced. So Coate goes on to observe that the perversion of the personal's political argument, quote, was not invented by those gay women who may be using it now. The women's movement has had sporadic waves of personal attacks on women, always in the guise of radicalism. I have seen women told that they could not be trusted as feminists because they wore miniskirts, because they were married, or because they wanted to have children, end quote. So if we step back for a minute, this assumption that we can subvert or overthrow the gender system by simply engaging in certain gendered or sexual behaviors but not others, this seems totally preposterous. There have been gender outlaws and sexual outlaws of various stripes since the dawn of history, yet our mere presence has never once made sexism vanish into thin air. I'd have to be pretty full of myself to believe that I could simply undo the gender system by behaving in one way or another. Such notions may be self-reassuring, but they ignore the fact that acts of sexism occur not by how we dress or identify or have sex, but through the way we see and treat other people. Sexism occurs when we assume that some people are less valid and natural than others because of their sex, gender, or sexuality. It occurs when we project our own expectations and assumptions about sex, gender, and sexuality onto other people, and police their behaviors accordingly. It occurs when we reduce another person to their sex, gender, and sexuality rather than seeing them as a whole legitimate person. That is sexism. And a person is a legitimate feminist when they have made a commitment to challenging sexist double standards, and I would argue other double standards such as racism, classism, ableism, to name a few, wherever and whenever they arise. An individual's personal style, mannerism, identity, consensual sexual partners, and life choices simply don't matter into it. So, I'm going to end with asking this. How do we finally move beyond this perversion of the personal's political argument that has repeatedly created rifts and splits within feminism? So I have three proposals that I'd like to make. So first, whenever we come across a debate about whether some behavior reinforces or subverts the gender system, rather than engaging in that debate, we should instead ask ourselves which behaviors are marked, that is deemed questionable and therefore to the reinforcing versus subverting argument, and which are not. This will almost always expose some underlying double standard at work. So for instance, if someone says that women who wear miniskirts reinforce the gender system, we should ask why women who wear pants are not called out. Isn't this because feminine clothing is marked in our culture, and thus open to attention, interpretation, commentary, and critique, whereas masculine clothing remains unmarked and taken for granted? Second, we as activists and academics should stop forwarding gender artifactualist theories and arguments. Not only is gender artifactualism incorrect, I believe, but it is also inexorably linked to the perversion of the personal as political. After all, if gender and sexuality are entirely social artifacts and we have no intrinsic desires or individual differences, this implies that every person can and should change their gender and sexual behaviors at the drop of a hat in order to accommodate their own or perhaps other people's politics. This assumption denies human diversity, and as I've shown, often leads to the further marginalization of minority or marked groups. For decades now, we as feminists have been touting the fact that gender and sexuality are socially constructed. I realize that many people within the academy may have a nuanced understanding of what constructed means. But as someone who has been involved in more frontline activism over the last decade, I can assure you that most people, the overwhelming amount of people outside of the academy, equate gender is socially constructed with gender is just a construct. That is to say, they assume that gender is entirely an artificial made-up system and then therefore we can just challenge it by simply behaving one way or another. For this reason, instead of constantly saying that gender and sexuality are socially constructed, I propose that we forward a somewhat different model, a model that I would call a holistic view of gender and sexuality. So according to this holistic view, our genders and sexualities arise from an unfathomably complex interaction between a variety of biological and social factors. Because there's such a vast amount of biological variation between people, and because each of us is uniquely socially situated, we will all invariably fall all over the map with regards to our gender and sexual behaviors, gender and sexual behaviors resonate with us personally. This is why some of us grow up with profound, inexplicable desires to express our gender sexualities in ways that do not conform to cultural norms. And it's also why the perversion of the personal is political, that is, requiring a person to alter their genders and sexualities in order to accommodate some type of political agenda, is always a futile endeavor. Third, and perhaps most controversially, we need to stop pretending that there really is a gender system. Certainly for those of us who are deemed by society to be gender outlaws or sexual outlaws, sometimes it sure does feel we're up against a massive monolithic gender system, one that's institutionalized and which seems to permeate every facet of life. Conceptualizing sexism in terms of a gender system does provide a fairly decent first approximation of how sexism functions. But, like most models, it begins to fall apart when we look at exceptional circumstances. For instance, the way in which heterosexual women were sometimes marginalized in particular radical feminist circles, or the way in which some genderqueer individuals look down upon people who identify as women or men. These more atypical forms of sexism cannot be adequately explained via the concepts of patriarchy or heteronormativity or the gender binary and so on. But more importantly, when we start buying into the existence of a hegemonic gender system, it becomes all too easy for us to get caught up in the illusion that we are infallible warriors in the fight to bring down that system. Suddenly we start seeing the world in a black and white, cut and dried terms, where everybody is either with us or against us. When we get caught up in that illusion, it is easy to assume that any person who engages in any behavior that does not personally resonate with us must somehow be reinforcing or conspiring with that system. And when we accuse someone of reinforcing the gender system, it is always a dehumanizing act, as it allows us to ignore that person's appearance or perspective because, after all, they're colluding with our enemy. The truth is, there is no actual gender system, but rather just a myriad of different sexist double standards. Some of these double standards are pervasive, even institutionalized, while others are fleeting, temporary, or loosely held. Some double standards change or disappear over time, while others remain entrenched for century upon century. Some double standards are obvious to us, while others may remain beyond our awareness. We may fight with all our might to overturn certain double standards, yet at the same time, we may consciously or unconsciously hold or enforce other double standards. Viewing gender and sexual oppression as a myriad of double standards rather than a singular gender system is admittedly a lot messier, and it sounds way less sexy, and it is not easily summed up in a single soundbite or slogan. But I do believe that it's more accurate. And I also think it's important that it's also humbling, as it acknowledges that even though we may righteously challenge certain double standards, we nevertheless might hold or enforce other double standards without realizing it. In fact, it challenges us to both look for and root out all double standards, rather than viewing the world through a distorting single-issue lens. For example, as cissexual feminists have done when they view transsexuality solely in terms of male privilege, or as cissexual gays and lesbians have historically done when they view transsexuality solely in terms of straight privilege. Finally, as feminists, our goal should not be to move beyond gender or to bring on the end of gender, as if such a thing were actually possible. Instead, we should envision ourselves as working to bring an end to all double standards based upon sex, gender, and sexuality, as well as any other double standard that is unjustly used to demonize, delegitimize, and dehumanize other human beings. That's it. Thank you.